On the border between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, between the regions of Kungey-Alatuo and Tranzili-Alatau, there stretches the Chon-Kemin Valley. The once famous tourist route from Almaty to Lake Issyk-Kul passed exactly here. The outdoor KZ team is entering the Chon-Kemin via the Kodai border checkpoint. Lake Issyk-Kul remains on our right, and we're turning onto a mountain road towards the Kungey-Alatuo. The fall has already started painting the slopes in warm tones. The Kungey-Alatuo mountain coniferous forest consists of Tianshine spruce with the undergrowth of hawthorn, cotoneaster, briar and other shrubs. Tianshine spruce can live up to 300 years, reaching 60 meters in height and 2 meters in diameter. In some gorges in the middle of the last century, they artificially acclimatized larch. Pine groves were also planted by the forestry workers. From Turkey, Kungey-Alatuo translates as the slope facing the sun. Indeed, the mountain sun melts snow here even in the harshest winter months. It's a very convenient place for distant pasture animal husbandry. This geographical feature predetermines the local tenor of life as well as the size of wild animal populations. During winter, the northern slopes of the Kungey-Alatuo are hardly accessible. The steep Tranzili-Alatau peaks protect these mountains from excessive economic development. Kolsai-Kolderi National Park is located in the Kazakhstan's part of the ridge. Its southern slopes, facing Lake Issyk-Kul, on the contrary, are easily accessible. The climate here is soft, making it possible to graze cattle and hunt all year round, which affects wild animal populations. For instance, in the mid-20th century, the number of ibex here dropped significantly and morels disappeared altogether. Until recently, the contradictions between agriculture and environmental protection seemed unsolvable, or rather economic development had always taken priority. The communist economy, with its focus on extensive agriculture, forced state and collective farms to increase their mountain cattle populations every year. The situation had changed after Kyrgyzstan gained independence, with the emergence of tenant farmers. After the dissolution of state farms, it became possible to do certain things like building rural infrastructure, repairing roads and procuring expensive equipment only jointly. That was the beginning of farmer associations, some of which registered as NGOs. If, say, a horse costs 1,000 soms, 300 soms go to the general fund, so that the guys can use this money for biotechnical activities, and sometimes we need to combat poaching as well. The outdoor KZ team was invited to visit the hunting farm in the valley of the Chon-Kemin River established by local farmers. The time of our visit was chosen not by accident. During the same time, a group of international wilderness protection experts will come to Chon-Kemin. Our foundation assists public associations created by local residents with the aim of protecting wildlife. Initially, the main task of these public associations was to protect endangered wild animal species. When it all started in 2013, there were very few roe deer and other wild animals left. In the course of the last 5 years, their number has grown 5 times. Based on 2013 wild animal counts, there were only 33 Siberian roe deer, and in 2018 their population increased up to 192 animals.
В конце 20 века
By the late 20th century, humans and domestic animals accounted for 98% of the total mammal biomass on our planet. Now the share of wild animals in developed countries is growing. It's simple math. It's well known that a unit of land area is capable of feeding a larger biomass of wild as opposed to domestic animals. It's better to have 10 species of wild hoofed animals in a certain area than a herd of sheep. Each wild animal takes its own environmental niche. Ibex live in the mountains, morals inhabit forests, wild boar dig roots, and so on. Ecological pressure imposed by different species is less than from a herd of sheep, which don't eat that much grass but destroy alpine meadows. In addition, wild animals bring not only kilograms of biomass but also aesthetic pleasure. Wild animals lead to higher indirect income from tourism. In recent years, morals have started to return to the Chon-Kemin Valley, apparently from the territory of Kazakhstan. At present, about 30 morals live in the gorge. Local farmers and scientists want to forge such an ecosystem management system so that morals once again become a common local species. To do this, wild animals simply need a little bit of vacant land. In his novel The White Steamboat, Chingiz Aytmatov, a great Kyrgyz writer and a member of the Club of Rome, presented his philosophical interpretation of the parable about the mother moral doe and expressed his environmental ideas, popular among the prominent scientists and culture activists in the 70s of the last century. The writer retold the ancient legend of the Kyrgyz Bugu family about the mother doe that led the Kyrgyz people from the shores of the cold Yenisei River to the warm lake Issyk-Kul. Having settled in that fertile land, people had forgotten their roots and exterminated all deer around. The mother doe had left the Issyk-Kul mountains but promised to return when people become wiser. Why do they put antlers on top of graves? We are from the kin of deer, that's why. So that everybody knows that we are the children of the mother doe. The novel's character, a little boy, meets a moral in the mountains thinking that he saw the legendary mother doe who had returned because people have become better. The boy runs to the cordon to share the great news with his only friend, Grandpa Momun. Yet at home, he was awaited by the first in life great disappointment in humans. He witnessed like the cruel and greedy chief Orozkul ordered the weak Grandpa Momun to kill the deer. After that, the boy realized that over the past centuries, people had not become any better or wiser. I don't want to be a human, thought the boy. I want to become a fish and live in Lake Issyk-Kul. The novel was published in 1970. 40 years later, morals had actually returned to Chon-Kemin, and the locals decided to do everything possible to keep the moral population. Humans' attitude towards nature is changing, and a great deal of credit for this goes to Chingiz Aytmatov and other members of the Club of Rome. In 1970, the Club of Rome invited a group of scientists from the University of Massachusetts, headed by the young assistant Dennis Meadows, to build a computer model of global development. For 2 years, the researchers had worked on the dynamic model representing different scenarios of humankind development in its relation with the biosphere. The project outcomes were later published in the report called The Limits to Growth, the report for the Club of Rome. The first red time period marks the state of the world in 1972. The report did not say that the crisis would come immediately, but even then it was obvious that the same drivers that generated growth and progress in the 20th century could lead to serious issues in the 21st century if left unattended. In the 70s of the last century, humankind was spending up to 80% of the planet's reproducible natural resources. Over the past 40 years, the Earth's population has grown 2.5 times, and consumption has increased 5 times. Now we're using 170% of what the nature can give us. How is it possible to spend 170% of something? Martis Vaken-Agel, president of the Global Footprint Network, compared the planet's resources with our bank account. If we spend as much as we earn, then it's a sustainable strategy for future planning. But if we just eat up the inherited capital, then bankruptcy and poverty await us.
Недавно мы отмечали Всемирный день экологического долга. 1 августа, по-моему, это было.
Recently, on August the 1st, we celebrated the Earth Overshoot Day. Environmentalists do not consider this day a reason for celebration. But why August the 1st? Because today we are consuming about 170% of the resources that our planet is able to reproduce. Comparing it with a family annual budget, it turns out that by August the 1st we have already spent our total year's budget.
Весь свой годовой бюджет и дальше будем жить в долг.
The humankind has managed to overcome many threats described by nature conservationists of the 70s of the last century. Back then, the Rhine and the Mississippi rivers were like gutters full of poisonous waste. Yet today they have been cleaned. It's possible to swim in these rivers and even use their water for drinking. To a significant extent, it became possible thanks to the efforts of those who sounded the first alarm. In the early 20th century, they collected bisons and American turkeys by single species from zoos. And now in the US, they produce 30,000 bisons and 7 million turkeys a year. 100 years ago, it seemed that there was no place for wild animals in the densely populated Europe. Yet today, their hunting fauna counts millions of animals. Scientists came to the conclusion that our main issue is not the lack of resources, but their proper management. The transition to market economy in the post-Soviet countries was not always smooth. Not only the legal framework had to be changed, it was necessary to rebuild the fundamental relationship between the human and the nature. The target reforms were based on the experience of other countries. Luke Bond, an instructor from Australia teaching the psychology of combating poaching, came to the farm with a special training.
My name is Luke Bond. I'm a training consultant for law enforcement training for rangers particularly, but for wildlife crime investigators. I've worked more than 20 years as a ranger, a wildlife enforcement officer, and as an Interpol officer looking and investigating wildlife crime. I'm here in Kyrgyzstan running a training course for rangers here to help them deal with poachers and do their work safely and planned, professionally and thoroughly, so they can get the best results to protect the wildlife of Kyrgyzstan.
During the assignment of hunting land plots in Kyrgyzstan, public associations of local agricultural tenants are given preference. For the last 5 years, the Chon-Kemin Game Management Service has been guarding the site without any hunting. The first thing they want to do is to restore animal populations. At present, the organization's expenses are covered by ecotourism and grants from foreign donors. In the future, they plan to set up hunting tourism. What is the difference between game management service and state inspection? As employees of this public association, we cannot inspect cars, detain or take forced measures. We can put together a civil act, but not a protocol. In 2014, the State Agency for Environmental Protection and Forestry adopted the branch law on hunting and game management.
При добыче диких животных
According to the law, the fees for trophy hunting are distributed in the following way. Local communities receive 25%. 40% go to the hunting provider to pay for protection and biotechnical measures, and the remaining 35% go to the authorized person executing protection actions and to enhance the material and technical condition of nature protection personnel. Combating poaching is dangerous and not cheap, and thus the government of Kyrgyzstan decided to motivate its rangers with money.
Иск, причиненный природной среде, он возмещается государством.
The claim for damages to the environment is levied in favor of the state. 30% of the paid fine goes to the environmental officer who caught the offender and registered the violation in the form of remuneration. Every year we are discussing proposals to introduce a complete moratorium on hunting across Kyrgyzstan. As an alternative, we also propose to introduce a partial moratorium. As an experiment, the Kyrgyz government introduced a 2-year hunting moratorium in the Talas Valley and some sections of the Chu Valley. Scientists monitor these areas and, based on acquired data, develop further proposals for the government.
My attitude
towards the moratorium is negative. Why? Because flora and fauna represent renewable resources. Approaching it rationally, it's possible to use it continually. Let's take large-hoofed animals, for instance. Every year, depending on specific biological characteristics, they issue hunting quotas, which cannot harm the population. When the farm was newly established, there were very few eco-tourists, but now their number is increasing every year. To promote any tourist product, you need time and impeccable service. At present, foreign tourists come to Chon-Kemin almost every day. For example, today the delegates of the regional meeting of the International Union for Conservation of Nature ordered a horseback tour. The International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, or IUCN, was established in 1948. Its main goal was to create a world list of animals under the threat of extinction. The list was called the Red Book, and its first edition came out in 1963. Now IUCN includes 82 countries, 111 government agencies, over 800 non-governmental organizations, and about 10,000 scientists and experts from 181 countries across the world. IUCN also enjoys the observer status with the UN General Assembly and thus is one of the most influential global environmental organizations.
Hi, I'm Rosie Cooney from IUCN Joly. We've been having a meeting here in Kyrgyzstan to talk about community-based wildlife management, that's plants and animals, across the wider Central Asian region.
Joly is one of the working groups of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Its full name is the Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group. Such a long name means that the IUCN strategy does not aim isolating the nature from humans, but on the contrary, designing and introducing sustainable mechanisms of using wildlife resources for the benefit of people.
What we've been doing in these discussions is to focus on community-based wildlife management. So the idea here is that we can reduce the threats to wildlife, which in this region are particularly illegal hunting and harvesting of wild plants and habitat degradation. We can combat these threats by actually promoting and supporting sustainable use of wildlife in a way which is good for conservation and which actually delivers livelihood benefits to local communities. And the difference here is that people can then see wildlife as a valuable resource.
The team is going up the gorge where they will have to leave their horses and continue on foot. The path snakes along the river. These willing to see wild animals will have to climb a steep hill. Eco-tourists appreciate ethnic flavor, fresh air and beautiful landscapes. But traveling across modern national parks around the world, they are used to taking pictures of wild animals. Therefore, seeing no morals, no ibex, roe deer or bears, their eco-tour across the Tian Shan Mountains will appear incomplete. Wild animals are a necessary attribute of any ecological trail.
In Australia, this many raspberries costs about $7.
In Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, it costs about $2. Wild raspberries are so good, simply delicious.
IUCN has a long-standing agreed policy on sustainable use of wild living resources. These are wild plants and animals. So IUCN sees that sustainable use can be an important conservation tool because the benefits that societies gain from this use can be a powerful incentive, a motivation for conservation of species and their habitats. And this includes trophy hunting. Trophy hunting can be very badly managed, but it can also be extremely well managed. And there are good examples of trophy hunting around the world that are delivering positive conservation benefits, as well as important livelihood benefits for local communities.
The experts got the general idea of the mountain ecosystems of Küngey Alatou, and it's time for them to move to the National Biosphere Reserve located on the slopes of the Kyrgyz Alatou. The reserve covers the upper streams of the Chunko-Chak River at the foot of the chain of 5,000-meter high summits. The reserve's buffer zone has a recreation area with dozens of boarding houses. One of them will host the IUCN conference.
And the purpose of our coming together here, of course, is to try to cooperatively find the best ways to maximize benefits to all countries and to all people and to all governments for conserving wildlife and sustainably utilizing wildlife in their own countries. We all know that wildlife is extremely important to people all over the world. And we also know that how countries deal with their wildlife and how well they maintain it and look after it is part of what makes a country strong and makes a country a positive place for its citizens, and also which gives it a positive profile in the world.
Biologists and environmentalists from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Russia, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, South Africa, the US, Germany, Canada and the UK are taking part in the conference.
The policies of the IUCN are very broad and they encompass a wide spectrum of activities for conservation. But one of those is to find ways to sustainably use wildlife to benefit people, but at the same time to conserve nature. So, for example, fisheries, international fisheries, are a way that we use wild creatures in a sustainable way to benefit people as a food source and as a way of creating employment. Similarly, with the hunting of wild creatures, these offer up opportunities to bring benefits to local people who live in the areas where the animals themselves live. And because they provide economic incentives and other benefits to the people, the hunting activity can be positive, but it can also incentivize those people to care for the wildlife in their regions. So as an organization, one of the policies that we try to support and provide advice on is how to have sustainable hunting in various regions of the world in order to bring these benefits to people and to incentivize them to care for the wildlife that, after all, is theirs.
Each delegate will report on the history of nature protection in his or her country, will share their successes, challenges, concerns and hopes.
Очень важно сохранить природу гор Центральной и Средней Азии, да и многих других горных территорий.
It's very important to preserve the nature in the mountains of Central Asia and many other mountainous areas. This task is closely linked with the operation of modern hunting farms managed with the account of local traditions as well as cultural and ethnic peculiarities.
Hunting
is a means of management with the least impact on natural biocenosis.
самое наименьшее воздействие на природные биоценоз.
Any other type of management, be it agriculture, mining or other activities, are generally associated with irreversible, destructive consequences for the nature.
Как правило, оказывают непоправимые воздействия, разрушительные воздействия на природу этих мест.
The key message in the speeches by delegates from different countries was the idea that one cannot protect and maintain nature only by restrictions. Success is possible when nature protection takes account of the interest of people sharing the same habitat with animals.
My name is Gerhard Damm. I am a resident of South Africa, but I'm born in Germany. I lived all around the world, in Asia, in South America, and in Europe. And I'm retired, and I do now mostly publishing work and writing books, writing articles concerned with conservation.
The experts emphasize that each country is different geographically, socially, culturally and economically. The model and approaches that are working well in Sweden may not work, for example, in Afghanistan or in Iraq. While each country has to look for its peculiar and unique methods, the general principles of sustainable use of natural resources for the benefit of people should remain irrespective of what country we're talking about.
And I think, apart from having this meeting here in Kyrgyzstan, it is very important that the other Central Asian states, like Kazakhstan, for example, also hold meetings, because the circumstances in each country are somewhat different, and we can then have a targeted approach with specialists to address especially these circumstances. And it would be great to come to Kazakhstan one day to discuss with all the stakeholders how we can improve the livelihoods, the practices, the hunting concepts.
Delegates from Afghanistan and Iraq said that even in the worst conditions of military conflicts, the energy of individual enthusiasts allows achieving impressive results.
Our experience around the world has shown that we can use nature sustainably, and that hunting can form a great part in this effort. We have also examples where nature is not used sustainably, or where nature is not used at all, and where the outcomes are negative for conservation. The first example of sustainable natural resource use and positive conservation outcomes comes from Namibia, with the communal reserves in Namibia, which lifted up the livelihoods of the local people and at the same time created jobs, created employment, and created opportunities for conservation. The negative example is Kenya, where hunting was prohibited in 1977, and where we now in 2018 have approximately 80% loss of wildlife species. Not only huntable species, not only big game, but also small game, plants, employment opportunities in the natural resource environment.
In the evening, at the campfire, hunting experts and representatives of green organizations are discussing the meeting's outcomes as friends. It turns out that there are not so many contradictions between them.
It is absolutely imperative that in future the non-hunting conservation organizations and the hunting conservation organizations work together, because, let me tell you, there are maybe 5 or 10% where we have differences in opinion. In 90%, we are agreeing. Let's work on the 90% to achieve natural resource use and conservation parallel.
The guests are leaving for their home countries, now sharing the common goal of preserving the wild nature of Central Asia.